there hasn't been a church planted in every state or province, or even every county, as like some other denominations. But again, quantity is not important here. What do they stand for? I'd rather have a few churches scattered around the continent that stand for something than multiple churches in every state or county that stand for nothing. So, when establishing separation, most importantly, doctrinal separation needs to be, as said before, must be based in Scripture. Paul says in Corinthians, the second epistle, chapter 6, verse 17, says, "Wherefore come out from among them, and be separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you." And this is also the same passage where we see where he instructs us not to be unequally yoked. And that's not just talking marriage, while that is certainly very important, but he's also talking about relationships in general, business relationships. So we need to be careful, who we or how we commit to certain things. And he also, if ever there is a verse or verses that are clear on doctrinal separation, Galatians 1:8. I'm sure many of you have heard this one, but though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. In other words, let him be cut off. Those are pretty strong words, but he's not talking a physical cutting off, just to be clear here. But he's saying that we should not have fellowship with such people. Of course, that it doesn't mean we don't have friends in the world. It doesn't mean we can't be friends with that person, but we should not fellowship with them in such a way that, in other words, we shouldn't have people like that come and preach at our church.
Yeah.
I can only imagine today's pastor, if he started out a sermon like Paul did in Galatians 3, where he says, "Who has bewitched you?" And as you know, that was a pretty scathing lecture the Apostle Paul gave to the Galatians there. I think today you probably have some people who walk out, and who knows, maybe even have a church split over something like that. Because you certainly have plenty of people in the pews today who will take a stand not to stand. And are all too eager to protect their false sense of comfort. And again, I use my father as an example here. I was just a child at this time, and I think we were living in Mississippi when this took place. So I was barely even old enough to be in school. So I don't have a personal memory from this, but I remember my dad talking about this. And he was preaching at this church, but he also taught the Sunday school class beforehand. And so afterwards, and this was I'll just say a Reformed church with highly educated people, at least on paper anyways. But after my father had taught for a good half hour or so, since it was a Sunday school class, he opened it up for comments and questions. And again, like I said, these were, if if you were to total up, even if they weren't all necessarily college graduates, if you totaled up the amount of credit hours these people took, I'm sure it would be a huge amount. And anyways, he allowed them to ask questions, comments, and basically for a while, all you probably could hear was the crickets. And so there was several minutes of awkward silence, and finally someone mustered up the courage to express their joy over some actor that didn't win an Oscar. They were so happy about that. After a Sunday school lesson. And my father just simply said that he isn't really fascinated with Hollywood. He doesn't really care about what goes on there. He didn't tell them they have to boycott, movie theaters or burn their records, burn certain books, and take a sledgehammer to their TVs. No, he just simply said for, scriptural reasons that he's just not fascinated with Hollywood, and he got quite a backlash from that, which is just ridiculous. It's just yelling at somebody because they don't like the same flavor of ice cream as you do. That I find, because that was probably a good 30, 40 years ago, and as we well know, things are not improving. So it makes you question what do they unite on? We're certainly not talking. We're talking of separation. We're not talking of isolation or a real harsh intolerance, but it's about standing for the truth and standing and having fellowship with those who uphold that same truth. And it's far more than just shouting a few 3 or 4 word slogans like "No creed but Christ." That's nice and it's true, but how many people in the world are really going to know what that means? And of course, I don't need to repeat, we like our creeds. What do creeds do? They explain things. So it explains why we have no creed but Christ, or why we preach that Christ is the only way. That would be a far better slogan than "No creed but Christ." And just as an example here, I'm sure many of us, we've worked a job where the policies and procedures weren't very clear. The atmosphere was very unorganized. We all know that can be very stressful. Of course, that's why most businesses will have an employee handbook. Why schools have an employee handbook, to give us something to unite on, so we can all turn to for when things we're not clear on something. We can turn to the handbook, and often in those handbooks you find a mission statement, and this is geared to unite the company. So we as human beings don't want to go into a profession blind and untrained. So even something as trivial as sports requires teamwork and unity. And since we're down south, I'm going to use football as a good example. Football, if ever, if ever there's a time needing unity and teamwork, it's that football team. And you got to have a coach that knows how to unite all 22 starters, the offense and defense. So a coach doesn't just tell his QB to go out there and throw away because he has a strong arm and has fast receivers. No, he's got to find out how they complement one another. What kind of, does he have linemen of 300 pounds, or are they smaller than the other team? So he's got to find a way to, make that team gel. So why should the church be any different? Why should we treat something so important as eternity any different? So you got to take into account the biblical model of what the church is supposed to be. The church is first and foremost supposed to be an institution of truth and preaching that truth, making disciples. So that rules out any gimmicks of trying to cater to the world, trying to fill the pews at any cost. And I've heard from many wise pastors that will tell you the way you draw them in is the way you're going to keep them. So any church that seeks to follow after the biblical model, very simply, the Bible must reign supreme. Sola Scriptura.
Amen.
Must be the supreme principle, and Christ must reign preeminent. He must be king. We'll stop there for tonight, and let's have a word of prayer, and then I'll turn the rest over to our next speaker. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us here. We thank you for the blessing of having a place that we can meet freely without harm. We just pray that we as Christians would not take these things for granted, as we know the times are not getting better. We just pray that we would remain strong in these difficult times and remember those across the world who are in far more difficulties than we are. Lord, help us not to forget them. Help us to support them, pray for them, help them in whatever way we can. We just ask for your guidance on this flock. We just pray as we go out into our jobs, whatever we do throughout the week, you watch over us, keep us safe. We also just pray for anyone that's feeling sick, Lord. We just pray you help them and bring them back to full health and strength. And we just pray for your watch care over us through this night, throughout the week. We ask all these things in your name. Amen.